Good afternoon. Welcome. I've got Gitu Bhatia with me today, and we're going to be talking about marriage and family therapy and divorce and family law issues. And so thank you very much for being with us.
You're very welcome. I'm excited to be here. This is an important subject, and a lot has been going on in the world right now that makes it even more pertinent.
So I've been very impressed. I've attended some CLE events at which you've been the speaker. And one of your specialties is the cultural dimension of family law. You are a licensed psychologist, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you have your degree from Pepperdine?
Yes, my doctoral degree is from Pepperdine.
And you've taught at various institutions, is that correct?
Right. I love to teach. So I'll give you a background of my work. I started working as a family mediator for the courts after I got my master's degree. And I did my internship there, and I continued to work as a family mediator and learned a lot about families going through divorce and separation and their needs through that process. And after working there for 10 years on and off as needed, because I had children at that time, young children at home, I went back for my doctoral work, and I brought in my experience with family law along with my passion and interest in cross-cultural psychology. And when I started my private practice, I combine the two, and I find that to be very consistent with my values and passions. So half of my practice is not related to family law, but the other half is. And I do co-parenting work, and I work with individuals who are going through divorce and separation.
I would imagine that working within the court system was a very good training ground for you. Just briefly, are there any differences between the type of clients and problems that you've dealt with within the court system and in your private practice?
Yes, for sure. I think in the courts, it was primarily helping families work out custody and visitation plans for their children. So the role was strictly as a mediator, whereas in my private practice, I work as a therapist. I do couples work, people who are not going through divorce, and if they do end up being in, ending the marriage, then divorce counseling and helping them with the co-parenting issues is the next natural thing. So my private practice has a range of clients.
If a couple are contemplating getting separated or divorced, is it a good idea to see a therapist, and why? And to see you?
Absolutely. I think, there are emotional consequences, but there's also legal and financial consequences, cultural consequences, social consequences to making that decision of separating. I think going through it mindfully makes the most sense, especially if there are children involved. And there's also the advantage, if you learn more about yourself through this process, then you're less likely to continue making those same mistakes in other relationships. So there are times when people come in thinking that they want to go through a divorce, but they learn how to better communicate with each other. They feel heard and understood, and they decide not to go through a divorce. So it can, help heal and help change the direction of the relationship at times. But if they are making a decision to divorce, they're going to do it in a way that's emotionally safer for them and more thoughtful, rather than being reactive to the situation.
So are they seeing you as a couple then, or do you see individuals, one spouse?
It depends. I think if they come in as a couple contemplating divorce, then I continue to see them as a couple. But if they're coming in as an individual, I would refer them for couples therapy or for divorce counseling, in addition to what they're doing individually, because there's room for all of that. And I think there is still a stigma about therapy, that people don't use therapy, but I often explain it to them as the same as going to the gym to help work on your body. It's a way of working on your emotional well-being that's equally as important. And it's not just for people who are, in a dire situation or have mental illnesses. That's part of the work we do. But relationship issues can be really difficult to manage on your own.
I'm representing, or I have represented, a bunch of attorneys in their own divorces, and one of the things they tell me is that they before they got divorced, they felt very competent and efficient and able to handle very difficult situations, a lot of stress, litigation, trials. But then when it came to their own situation, it was overwhelming. They just simply couldn't cope anymore. And so I refer them to a therapist, because one of the things I've observed over the years is that the skill set of a therapist is very different from an attorney. Is that something you can speak to? I mean, we don't get trained as lawyers to deal with sort of the emotional dynamics
Right.
of, a relationship.
Going through a divorce has been equated to, actually been studied to have the same kind of impact on your emotional well-being as going through a death of someone. So it's a grieving process. It's one of the highest stressors people can experience. It's like a seismic shift in your emotional well-being. So whereas you can work with other people with their issues quite well, when it comes to your own emotional well-being, you don't have the objectivity or the clarity. And it's the way brain research shows us is that when we're flooded with emotions, our frontal lobe, which is the organizing part of our brain, seems to be compromised. It can't be as organized and efficient and being able to go through life in the same way as if you weren't flooded with these emotions. So you become paralyzed. And I'll give an example. I was sharing with you that I had some computer problems this week, and the consequence of not being able to retrieve my documents and things like that, it was overwhelming. And I had to hand over some of this responsibility to my husband to get it fixed, because I wasn't even able to think straight. And so, but I can do everything else in my life very efficiently. It's just that part of my brain was just, I couldn't put sentences together. It was just so overwhelming. So you can be completely competent and aware and able to do normal things. But when your whole life is shifting from under you and changes are happening and things are out of your control, it really is helpful to have someone hold your hand through it, provide you with some objectivity, some empathy, some concern, and guidance. So these are the kinds of things therapists can do in the process of divorce.
I just want to tell you that I've got my 12-year-old son on retainer. He does all my IT work now in the house, and he sends me bills with interest.
Well, good for him.
And he's actually quite good at it. He knows both the Macs and the PC. So,
and normally I'm very good at it. You know that I've developed an app, and so I'm pretty tech savvy and understand. But I was making a point of, when you're personally affected, a lot of your ability can depart from you for a while. And so it's good to recognize that sometimes asking for help is actually the best thing you can do. and the smartest thing to do.
So that was a wonderful segue into your app. And the app is called, am I correct, Divorce Works. Tell us a bit about that.
So a few years ago, my colleague, Dr. Linda Bortel, and I were attending a conference.
I'm going to have a coffee if that's okay.
Yes, sure. We were at a conference where Sesame Street released an app for children to learn how to deal with emotions related to divorce. And it was really interactive and amazing. And we both looked at each other and said, is there something for grown-ups that is the same? And we went through the App Store looking for anything, and we didn't find anything that was interactive and provided information. And both of us have had 30 years plus of experience working with divorcing families. So we said, let's try doing that. And we pulled up a notepad and started writing down what we thought were useful things, and developed an app for people to be able to soothe their feelings. We recognize that not everyone has access to therapy or have the financial ability sometimes to be able to utilize therapy. So we wanted to provide something that people could use and have available to them while they were going through their emotional process. So it's been well received, and it's a very inexpensive, app, $5, less than a coffee these days, but it allows people to journal their
$5 a month or $5 flat fee?
Flat fee forever.
Oh, wow. I better subscribe.
Yeah, and it provides, there's a section on knowledge where you can read about the different aspects of divorce and learn about maybe how to tell your children, how to think about co-parenting, how, dealing with different aspects of divorce. And then there's a section where you can record your emotions, 6 different emotions on a daily basis, by just, on a scale of 1 to 10, how sad you're feeling, how angry you might be feeling. And actually, one of the coolest things on it is disgust. And a lot of my clients will tell me that's the one that I really enjoy kind of noting.
Disgust.
Disgust is one of the 6 feelings that, people feel during this time. So angry, sad, and also happy at times. So, when they record their emotions, they get the opportunity of journaling their feelings, why they're being, feeling so intensely angry, and once they've journaled, they get the option of looking at cooling and comforting tips. So some ways of taking care of those intense feelings and coping mechanisms that they can use. There's also a section on self-care. So the app gives 6 suggestions per week of things to do. And if you're parents, then 2 of the suggestions are related to parenting. And if you complete 4 out of the 6, your heart fills up in the app. So that encourages people on a weekly basis to keep thinking of self-care. When they're going through a divorce, they're often, worried about a ton of other things, and self-care tends to fall by the wayside. And it's also especially true for men. When I talk about cultural
because men, we love journaling and talking about our feelings, don't we?
No, but given the opportunity to do it in private, they're more likely to do it.
Yes.
And the encouragement to think about self-care is not a weakness, but that's a strengthening thing, is really, I think men find it more valuable. They tend to, I'm generalizing, but, we're socialized men are socialized to think of themselves as strong, and asking for help is seen as a weakness. So this is a private way of accessing help. And also many different cultures stigmatize therapy a lot. So this is a way that people can access it. And we made sure that we address those issues in the app, because that's often neglected in the mainstream, books and so forth.
Well, I'm gonna tell all my clients to subscribe, and I'm gonna subscribe. So it sounds like a wonderful app, because one of the things I've done for many years, I go on Amazon, and I've always given out the Divorcing the Sandcastles Way,
Yes.
which is an excellent book, but it's not interactive. It's something that you can sort of, I tell people, clients to dip into when they need it. Some do, some don't. But your app is interactive, which I think is an excellent way of monitoring your feelings and emotions.
And speaking of the Sandcastles book, we do have a section in the knowledge section that provides resources and books for parenting or for individuals going through divorce. So there are, a lot of really good books, but I think, again, I think one of the feedback I got was that when you're going through a divorce, you feel like you're going through this fog with very little direction of where you're going, and having the app sort of is like a light, and a feeling of not being so isolated, that it's interacting with you, and you can, put down your emotions as they happen, so that there's also a way that they can keep record of the tracking the emotions. So over a month, if you find yourself being really angry, for example, then you can bring it into therapy and say, I'm just not having a very successful time at reducing the anger, and what can I do, and so forth. But if you've seen your anger decrease over time, then you can also feel validated that you're doing the right things, that maybe anger was appropriate at one point, but I've learned how to cope with it. And disgust is probably something that can come and go, but that, you can sort of attribute it to the process being kind of sometimes really awful.
Because as an attorney, I often advise clients, particularly if they're going through a custody dispute, to keep a journal. But the purpose objective of keeping a journal is usually either defensive or it's to use as evidence. Whereas the purpose of your journal is entirely different.
Right. It's a personal sorting out of feelings. So there's also a brain research that shows that when you use your left brain, not that left and right brain don't function separately, they all work in an integrated way, but the language part is more left brain and the emotional part is more right brain. So when you do the act of journaling, you're integrating both the left and right brain, and it can have a very calming effect. So it has value for you as for anybody going through any part of your emotional journey, that, journaling is actually a really valuable tool for many people. And so this is really for a private purpose. You have your own passcode. This is not for the purposes of your legal issues, although you do have the ability to email your journal to your attorney if you would like. So, that's an option, but I think from an emotional point of view, it's more to really help you sort out your feelings, make sense of what's going on, and maybe look back at, later on saying, oh, I really made some progress in this area, or this is helpful or not helpful for me.
So I want to move on to another issue that we encounter a lot is how to bring the children into the process. Is that something that you do? You speak to the families and the children as well?
Yes, I often help parents figure out a way of talking to their children about this process. It's a very painful process for everyone, and at different stages of their development, children need different kind of information. And so helping them help their children is something that I do. I have met with children in the past, but I often encourage parents to do it together at home with their children and give them guidance on how to do it. Um, and mainly helping them come up with some kind of a story of their divorce that doesn't point to the other person's faults and problems as being, you know, letting the children know that they came into a marriage that was loving at one point, that they were uh, something that they wanted to have a family, and things haven't worked out. Mom and dad are not getting along, but we want to make sure that, you know, we always take care of you and we'll always love you. The kind of relationship we have with our children is different than the one we have with our spouses. So having people put aside their angry emotions and sadness and everything in the interest of helping the children have a coherent narrative of what is happening and what will happen.
Do you think it's do you think it's better for I'm getting feedback. You think it's better to equip the parents with that information so they can have a private conversation with the children at the home, or would you advise them to come to your office as a family unit and you can sort of mediate that discussion?
It depends on the situation and the level of conflict and the ability of the parents to provide that information to the children. So if I can strengthen the parents to be able to do it on their own and they have the capacity to do it, I think that's better at home because it's not something that in an hour will be resolved and done. It will take, and I often recommend to parents do it when you have a lot of time to deal with the children's emotions. Some kids will hear it at first, but not be able to comprehend it, and will take them 2 or 3 days before they'll have a reaction to it. Other kids will have a meltdown right away. And within the same family, it can have different impact on different kids at different ages. So it really varies. And so I have had, when parents are not comfortable talking to the children and they need the assistance, I've done it with them. But for the most part, I do help them, prepare them for these difficult conversations because they're going to have to continue doing this over time. Because children will react one way at the time of the separation, and they may 2 years later have a very different reaction because they're developmentally at a different stage. So this is a process, and I'm often meeting them at the front end of the process. But things change and people do come back and want simple parenting tune-ups after a while.
Now, during the process itself, one of the things that we hear often from judges and advice we get from lawyers is never talk about the divorce or never talk about custody with the children. And that's always seemed a very difficult thing to do. And we get mixed messages from lawyers and therapists about whether it's appropriate and how to talk about custody with the children, particularly if the children are older. That sometimes the psychic harm to a child, especially when they ask about what's going on, and you have to say, I'm not allowed to talk about it, is almost more damaging than if you were to explain in very simple, objective terms, what is in fact going on. So how do you approach that question when a child says to you, am I going to go and visit with my mother, or what's the custody order, or those kind of questions?
Right. I think when there are orders not to talk about the divorce and custody, it's because there is a conflict that is trying to be resolved and so forth. I think that it is wise not to include the children in the custody conflict in the legal process, but letting them know what is happening and what to expect, and also the uncertainty about it, that we're not able to agree on what's the exact schedule we're going to have and where we're going to live. And a lot of these things are up for discussion that will be an honest and not a burdensome thing to put on the child. But if you say to the child, your dad is being such an, SOB, and he's not doing this, and you don't want to go see him, and this is the problem, that then puts the child in a loyalty bind. They love, most children love both their parents, and they don't want to hear negative things about the other parent. And worry about what's going to happen in the courts. It's very stressful for parents who are going through a custody dispute. You don't want to add that stress onto your children's shoulders also during that time. So it's important not to include them in your conflict, but it's really important to give them some outline of what's going on, because they have very little control over their lives. And not even to know what's to be expected makes it harder for children to adjust. But if they know they're going to be able to see their parents, they just haven't figured out what the schedule is that's best, things like that. So I think giving them some honest explanations is really important. And I know sometimes people will say, well, I want to be honest with them and tell them how awful the other person is and how it's their fault. And that's not what I mean by honesty. I mean that giving them an outline of what's happening and what they can count on are things that really reassure children, help them get through a difficult time better.
And do you have an opinion on, in California, if the child is of a sufficient maturity and a certain age, we allow them to express their preferences to a court if we can't resolve the issue through mediation. What are your opinions about that, and what is the best vehicle to do that? What's the best procedure?
Well, I think it's important for children to be able to voice their feelings to their parents and feel that they're being heard, depending on their age, of course. But it's also a very burdensome thing for children to feel they are left with a decision that their parents can't make, the judge is relying on them. It's unfair responsibility put on a child. But as they get older and we're encouraging children to become independent in their lives, we do want to include their thoughts and their decision making. When a child is 2 years old, we give them choices of, you want broccoli or peas. You try to give them choices and let them make some choices so they feel they have control over their lives. When they're 10, we gave them different kinds of choices. And when they're 15, we have a wider responsibility that we put on them. And they have to start making choices in their lives too. So I think it's important to give them some sense of control on what's going on in their lives. So if a mom and dad can sit down and say, we want to hear what you think. This is what we've decided. This is what we're struggling with. What would be your preference in terms of this or that? I think that's a reasonable place for a 15-year-old perhaps to be able to talk to their parents. But if it's in the context of a court and there's intense fighting between the parents, that can be a huge burden on a child to have to bear. So it varies and it's different. I think children should have a sense of some amount of control over their lives as they're going through this, but putting too much burden on them, that's the balance that we have to find.
Because we have within the court system, there's several ways that children can let their opinions be known to the judge. One is to do an evaluation in which a mental health professional speaks to the child. That would be one way. Another way would be for the court to, in a very difficult case, to appoint minors counsel. And that is an attorney, not necessarily trained as a psychologist, but an attorney who then speaks to the child. And then I guess the third way is for the judge directly to speak to the child either in court or in open chambers. And I know for a fact that one or two of the family court judges have a psychology background, but I think most do not have a psychology background. And I'm not sure the extent to which they have training to speak with children as their dependency court counterparts do. What are your thoughts about that? What's the best way to express their preferences to a judge?
Well, I think you're right about if a judge feels equipped to talk to kids and has gone through trainings, and I know many judges do, to figure out a way of talking to kids and finding out their preferences without putting them in a bind in these situations, then that's fine. But I think anytime you can have a mental health person trained in working with children to provide that information, it's better that way. And I also acknowledge that, the process child custody evaluation should be limited to the very extreme conflict situations and not something used unless it's absolutely necessary, because it's a burden on everyone, and it's a financially costly process. It often puts people on opposite sides, and they feel they have to, stack up their cases. And even if they weren't starting out at a bad place, they can become more polarized during this process. So it is certainly on the bell-shaped curve, I think, for people who are at the end of very high conflict situations.
I don't know, it just occurred to me, but Thomas Lyons, a professor at USC, has the lab which dependency court uses to send very difficult cases of child abuse to be interviewed by trained students and psychologists. And are family court judges in the Los Angeles County system, do they go to that training, or is it just simply dependency judges?
I don't know. I'm actually not aware of this lab. But I think the issue of child abuse and domestic violence is one of those situations that's at the very extreme.
Yes.
And you do need people who are specially trained in it to be able to work with those families.
And those really are the most difficult cases to
Yeah.
handle.
Difficult cases, difficult situations for kids to be in.
Yeah. And that in itself is a pandemic. It's we recognize that domestic violence now should be treated as a public health issue, as a pandemic. Talking to pandemics, how has your practice been affected by this COVID pandemic, just as a practical and emotional way?
Like I said, I've sort of been involved with technology, and I did have Zoom as an option available in my practice, but I very rarely utilized it. It was only if someone was traveling abroad, or I needed to work with people in different states at some point. But in March, I was teaching a course at UCLA, and we switched to Zoom on March 12th. That was the last class. And from that day on, I switched all of my, clients to online. And I hear...
Okay, we just had an interruption, a COVID-related Zoom interruption.
Right. So from, March 12th onwards, I switched to Zoom and telephone, and most of my clients continued. I think some couples that I was working with, it was a little bit harder for them because they had their children at home. They didn't have the privacy. But it's been a seamless transition. I've started working with new clients as well during this time on Zoom. And our hesitancy always was that it wouldn't have the same personal feeling as in sitting in the same room and coming to the office and so forth. But for the most part, people have been pretty happy. And some people actually have said, I'm going to continue doing this. I don't have to, take off an extra hour for travel or pay for parking and all of those things. So it's simplified some for some people the ability to use mental health services. Um, so for us, it hasn't been much of an impediment. I don't see children in my practice normally, so I know that therapists who are working with children have a little bit harder time because the kids are on Zoom for school and then they go into, so it's an overload of, and also a lot of times working with children, you need to use play equipment and
Hmm.
stories and artwork, and that's not as easy to do online. But for me, it's been fine. And actually, a lot more people are finding that they're more stressed and anxious and need support and help and are feeling isolated. So I think that there are a lot more people reaching out for mental health services. And by having it on Zoom, it has simplified. People don't have to take off as much time to be able to do this. So we're learning some things about what are advantages and disadvantages of working this way.
Well, I think with children, they're extremely resilient, and as a group, they've grown up with technology, so I think they're less fearful of the technology than many adults are. And again, there's always pros and cons. I think some children um, have actually used the technology to expand their social networks, particularly sort of highly gifted children or children who are adept with computers and technology and like social media. They actually find it quite empowering to use Zoom and be in classes and be in groups. Other children would prefer to interact in person. So I think I guess there's going to be a lot of research coming out of this for years to
Right.
come.
We have been thrown into a social experiment without our permission and willingness, and we're going to find out how we all react. But in terms of children, there's a mixed bag. Um, Children developmentally, like at the very young age of preschool age or teenagers, really need a lot more social contact to figure
Hmm.
out life. They have to figure out what the rules are of relationships and, social situations and so forth. So I think they are going to be the most negatively impacted from
Younger
this
children. Yeah.
isolation, the young children and teenagers who do need that contact. But children who are avoidant also are going to not benefit from this because they can avoid social situations now with a good excuse. So I think that we have to see which kids are more needing of social contact and should be in a interactive situation, and which children can do fine without being in school. Um,
I think
so
that the social isolation caused by this pandemic and all the other attendant problems have led a lot of people anecdotally to say it's going to lead to a lot more divorces and custody problems. I'm not yet seeing that. I don't know if you are, but what are your sort of predictions? What do you
I
think is going to happen?
I think the reports do show that there's a higher um, uh, questioning of relationships when people are forced to be in close quarters and the system is not healthy and strong, that it's going to fall apart. So again, I'm reading about it, that there are more inquiries about divorce, and people are feeling higher levels of stress. there's also the reality that many people have lost jobs and income. And so one of the marital stressors is financial
Yes.
changes. And then you're in close quarters with children's responsibilities. Somehow people have landed in a gender typical kind of role. The moms are having to do more than the dads. And so the conflict about child rearing, which is, a huge stressor in marriages, is also increasing. So it does indicate that there would be more potential problems.
Yeah. No, I think we're going to see that play out, and in probably in unexpected ways.
Mhm.
I want to get to one of the subjects on which you're an expert, which is the cultural dimension of divorce and families. And you've spoken a lot about that at various seminars. I'm not sure even where to start on that question.
Mhm.
Because in Los Angeles County, I think it's fair to say that we possibly are the most diverse county in the world. Most people would say it's New York, but I've seen statistics uh, where we speak more languages, have more different nationalities than any other county or place on the planet. And so within the, I see the court system and people coming to me speaking lots of different languages. But how does culture play a role in divorce or family law issues?
Well, I'll start at a level, uh, in this pandemic, we have actually come to also see all the social inequities that exist. And I think one of the things I've been passionately talking about is that psychology as a discipline and legal disciplines tend to be Eurocentric. The laws that we have, what we think is healthy and normal as a family or for parenting, all is based in a very Western framework. And so when families are going through divorce and separation that come from other cultures, they don't always feel that that's being recognized or honored, and that they're being judged as being weird and strange, or their issues might be not given the importance. If you're going through a child custody evaluation and the evaluator never asks you what's typical for your family, what are the traditions that your family
Mm-hmm.
experiences, what languages do the different kids speak, or you're right, there's Los Angeles has like 40% of the population speaks another language at home. So, in many ways, these issues of culture are not seen as important when they are very important in how we parent our children, what we think a family should look like, and how divorce is stigmatized in different cultures. And so, the legal system has always been, in the effort to be impartial, has tried to be colorblind. But we know by being colorblind, we're blind to people's needs and issues. So I think that's the important part, is for us to realize that we have our biases based in a Eurocentric model of divorce and family and so forth, that we need to be more open. And another aspect that has grown in the last 2 decades is the interracial and interfaith marriages. And therefore, children who are biracial or have two different faiths in their family have very different issues than their monoracial parents. So, say it's a white husband and a black wife, the biracial child isn't always necessarily going to identify with mom or dad. The assumption is one drop of black means he or she's a black person, but they may not feel necessarily aligned with one or the other. They may have their own identity issues. So I think it's important for us to be more aware of our bias, of the way that we deal with people, and to be more humble about the fact that we don't know many different ways people can be. Another example I often give is that, there's I'm Indian, and Indian parents demand a high level of education, as many Asian parents do, and there are these titles like Tiger Mom and so forth. And there's just this a negative bias sometimes put on those titles. Whereas what we've seen in research is that actually when there is a high level of authoritative parenting, but with a high level of warmth, that's not a bad combination. It can be very nurturing. There may be very high demand, but there's also a lot of coddling like goes on at the same time, so that we have to refresh our own thinking as we work with families from different ethnic backgrounds or cultural backgrounds, um, or families with disabilities or different religions. We do have sort of one way of thinking about families that doesn't always fit all. We need to have a more sensitive and expansive view of families.
And I think what you've raised is very important in our community. And it leads to a very an important conclusion, which is that given this multiplicity of cultural issues, which ultimately affects the best interest of the children, in California, as in most other countries, we use a best interest analysis in deciding how we're going to come up with a parenting plan or custodial arrangement. It means that probably you're going to get a better outcome if you mediate, the parents mediate with a mediator such as yourself, maybe a retired judge, and they can come up with their own solutions which allow you to take into account those cultural differences, rather than allowing the state, in the form of a judge, a stranger in effect. And as much as I very much appreciate the hard work and the objectivity of judges, I have a great respect for them and their public service. I think we also have to realize that they also bring to their job certain biases. And we try as a community to educate attorneys, judges, mental health professionals in this idea of cultural bias. But, we can't be entirely successful, because we can't be 100% empathetic, or we can't go into the shoes of every person from every different community. So I think the recognition that there is cultural bias, or that cultural differences, is a good reason, particularly with the pandemic and the virtual closure of the court system. It's another good reason why we should be looking to encourage parents to cooperate and mediate and come to amicable, settlements.
Yeah, I think, that's really been true and researched, that when parents make decisions for their children, as opposed to other people like judges or attorneys making decisions, those agreements last a lot longer and have beneficial effects on the kids than anything someone else can decide for them. So self-determination is something I strongly believe in. And to give parents the confidence that when they make the decisions, it will be the best for their kids, is part of what I do, is to that we have very sensitive, educated, informed judicial officers. I mean, I know from the Los Angeles county judges, and I do some trainings with them and so forth. I know that they really work hard at it, but we are limited by the experiences that we have. The lens through which we look at the world is going to be limited. Only parents can know in best circumstances what's best for their kids. But of course, if they can't decide, then they have all these other options. And in reality, it's a very small percentage, as you know, that end up actually going to court.
Yes.
You end up seeing a lot of them, but in the mix of things, a lot of people do come up with their own decisions. So if you're at a relatively moderate level of conflict, within a year or two of separation, the emotions do settle down, and the decisions, if they come from the parents, are going to be the better ones for the kids. And the kids are going to feel good about following those rules because it's the parents who came up with those rules.
That's
If a judge has decided, the kids could say, I don't want to follow that. I'm not, I'm not buying it. So I think for
Well,
many,
I'm dealing with that. In fact, that's what I've been doing all morning, dealing with that situation where there's a custody order that was made by a judge. The teen doesn't like that order, so they've just voted with their feet and they've taken an Uber to the other parent. And what do you do in that situation? So
yeah,
it's very interesting. It's been fascinating talking to you. I really appreciate our discussion.
well, thank you for having me. I think this was really a good discussion and sharing of ideas. So thank you for including me in this.
Okay, so my name is Warren Shiel. I'm a family lawyer in Los Angeles. I'm a certified specialist. I practiced in New York with legal aid, doing family law there for several years. And before that, in the United Kingdom. My website is www.la-familylaw.com. I'll put all this in the description on the channel. Do you want to give us your contact details?
Yes, I'm Dr. Geetu Bhatia. I'm a clinical psychologist. I practice in Los Angeles, but now with Zoom, I'm available to people all over California. And I have a website with my first and last name, geetubhatia.com. That's easy to remember. GITUBHATIA.com. And the app that I mentioned has a website as well, divorceworksmedia.com. So,
I'm going to subscribe after we get off this. That's the first thing I'm going to do. After I've fed the dog.
Okay. Thank you, Warren.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Okay.